Hi, everyone. I'm going to try something I've never done before. I'm going to do a little video of how to paint an orange and a carrot. It may not work, but we'll have a go. I'm going to switch to my other camera now. So I'm going to pin that one. So what I've got here is right mess, but I've got an orange and I've got a carrot for later. But it's the orange that I'm really going to have a go at. I've already tried a few, but I realized that mixing a really good, vibrant, sparkly orange color is not very easy. So let's go. I'm going to start with a little sketch of the orange. I've also cut a segment of it because I found when I painted just a big round orange, it was a bit boring. In preparation, I've got the simplest paints. I've got Cotman, Winsor Newton paints. Sorry, they're a bit messy, but I've put some water on the colours that I think I'm going to need. I've got lemon yellow, cadmium red, and alizarin crimson, and I've got sap green. I've also put a little bit of water on my blues just in case I want to make a green of a different tone. Most importantly, I've got a piece of watercolour paper that is just a scrap bit that is so useful. Not useful, it's essential. You must have this when you start watercolour painting because you need to try out the strength of your colour. And it often works better than a palette. I've also got lots and lots of water because I've got a jam jar of water here and I've got several more and a selection of brushes. I've got small round brushes, big fat round brushes. I've got flat brushes and I've even got some very tiny little detail brushes. That's because you just need them because you'll be swapping and doing different things. I've also got my porcelain palette, which looks like a mess, but I don't clean it because in some of these wells, I've squeezed tube paint in here, and tube paint is very expensive and you don't want to keep wasting it. So it doesn't matter if it dries because you can reactivate it. And sometimes there's a color that you've mixed by mistake that you need. So I like that. Watercolor painting is about accidents and allowing accidents to happen. You see, there's an accident already. You might need that and, that little smudgy bit. Maybe not on this particular item. Okay, let's go. So I'm just going to do with an HB pencil, I'm just going to do a very basic roundish shape for my big fat orange, just to guide me. It's not meant to be, the best drawing in the world, but it gives me a guide because the watercolor is going to be our friend. And I've got a little, it's almost a star shape, that little bit where the stalk comes out. So I'm just going to put that in. It sort of anchors it if you have a stalk. Quite fat. Been cut off. And also got what I call pleats. It's one of those oranges that has a few kind of little creases. Okay, so there's the start. While I'm here, I'm going to also just do the segment of orange. It's quite large oranges, and now you see a little bit of the rind. And then it's got the rind is quite thick on this. I'll just put that in. And of course, there are Just going to put a few indications of those little juicy cells that you get. And it's also got the center, which is a bit pithy, just gives me something to start with. So with all fruit, doesn't matter what color it is, whether it's red, green, orange, yellow, always start with a nice coat of yellow. And I always put lemon yellow. I mean, the clue's in the name, lemon yellow, nice citrusy color. And when you look at an orange, you'll notice that already you can see that this part is getting the light from the sun that's coming into my studio. And this part here is much darker. And this is more yellowy, and this is darker. But we want to get that depth of color. So that's why I'm going to start with a nice undercoat of lemon yellow. And so that it spreads nice and evenly over the orange, I'm just going to give it some water. You want to put this down so that it's damp, not shiny wet. And I can already see that it's a bit too shiny wet. So I'm going to use, I've got some kitchen towel and I've also got some makeup pads. So I'm just going to just lift off some of that water, just so that it's not too runny. Now, the other thing that's really important, and you may not be able to see, is that I've left a few highlights, especially around this area. I've left those dry because we don't want, we want to leave some highlights. We don't want paint on those. So this goes on nice and softly because it's wet. So it spreads nice and very nice. I like that. Oranges aren't even in color, so that's why I'm dabbing it a bit. Right, so that's lemon yellow. And I might as well, while I'm here, do the same thing over here. So while I've got it on my brush, so I'm going to wet that and put some nice lemon yellow over the segments of the orange and the edge of the rind. Lemon yellow is quite a greeny yellow, whereas the next color I'm going to go into is cadmium yellow. And I'm just going to test it. You can see that it's quite strong. I'll just show you the difference between lemon yellow and cadmium yellow. So that was the lemon yellow, which you can see is quite greeny, and this is the cadmium yellow. Cadmium yellow is very rich, and I always think of it as like an egg yolk yellow. So just clean off my brush and dab it and go back into the cadmium yellow and put that, dab that around a bit. And oranges aren't flat, so it doesn't hurt. I'm using a flat brush just because I quite like flat brushes. They give a fatter, flatter wash. But of course, I do want it a bit dabby too. And I find I prefer the marks that it makes. You'll probably notice that when you go over watercolour that's wet with another colour, sometimes it actually lifts the colour off, which it will do now because it's fairly damp. I'm just going to soften this white area a bit. I put some water on and diluted it a bit. And I'm going to just where I've got what I call puddling, you can see that's quite shiny there. I'm just going to soak that off, because sometimes when you get puddling, a pool of paint, and it dries, it pushes the other colour away, and you get what we call a cauliflower effect. You've probably seen that. It makes an uneven mark. And sometimes that can be lovely, sometimes not. I can just see some uneven bits around the edge, and with my brush, which is almost dry, and I use my fingers to check it's almost dry. Whoops, my orange is falling forward. I'm going to just gently even that out around the edge. Just spread it a bit because I want a crisp edge. Right, so that's the beginning. I'm going to get my hairdryer now just to dry this off, because the most important thing I've learnt, especially with oranges, in terms of colour, is that if it's in the slightest bit damp, everything goes a bit muddy and not very nice. So I'm going to mute my microphone for a moment. I use my hairdryer because in this climate, even though you think it's dry, it often isn't. And I know, even though it's feeling dry to my finger, because the watercolour paper is still a little bit buckled, I know it's not completely dry. But while I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to mix up some orange. Now, it would be tempting to just go straight into a colour that looks like orange. This is cadmium red pale hue, and it's very orange. I mean, it looks a bit red on screen, but it's quite orangey. And I find that's a bit strong. So what I want to do is to mix it with some cadmium yellow. And I'm mixing this on paper, this cadmium yellow. The reason I'm mixing it on paper is because I can immediately see the intensity of the color. If I mixed it in a palette when it was very liquid, I wouldn't be able to necessarily tell how strong it was going to be. I'll give you an example of that so that you know what I'm talking about. I'll just clean this palette here. And if I put the cadmium yellow in there like that, and add a bit of the cadmium red, doesn't look too bad, but it's actually come out quite light. It looks quite intense on the palette. It looks quite light. And I want something a bit more intense than that. And I can tell how intense it is because it's actually on the white paper, and it is the same paper that I use for the main event, if you like. It's not quite so transparent. So now I'm going to, now it's important to get your brush well loaded. So I'm going to mix a little bit more. I'm putting the cadmium red here, making sure there's lots of it. And then I'm going into the cadmium yellow. I've got two paint boxes here because one's got more of one colour in than the other. And then I'm going to go in and mix it and get my brush nicely loaded. And there, I've got a lovely Lovely orange there. Lovely orange colour. Okay, so now I'm going to go on top of the two other colours that I've got. And you've got to work fairly speedily with this. I'm just going to wet my brush a bit more because I don't want those crisp edges of colour inside the orange. It's okay if you have them on the outside of the orange. Oops, not on here. And I'm trying to sort of go with the shape of the orange, swirl it around a bit, go with it. I'm going to add a little bit more water just to make sure that it's liquid. Whoa, that's not wonderful. And I'm just going to sort of, those highlighty bits, I'm going to leave them a bit. I'm gambling a little bit here by trying to smooth it out a little bit. You can see I've got a dark bit up there. But it's dangerous to go over it now. I'll show you what, well, I'll do it and then you'll see what happens. If I go over this now, I'm going to end up with overworked brush strokes and they won't look very good. So I always say that with watercolour, your first answer has to be your final answer. Okay, so it doesn't look great at the moment, but it will, don't worry. Now, you can see that it's looking quite red around here, but if you half close your eyes, it's also got shadow on one side. So I'm going to mix up again on here, get my cadmium red. Nice rich cadmium red, pale hue it's called. There is a cadmium orange as well, but I haven't got it in my box. I could have used that, but I still would have used some yellow with it. And I'm going to mix it up. And that's more or less the same color as I had before, but I want to make it darker. So now I'm going to do something a bit tricky. I'm going to use blue to make it darker. And I'm going to use ultramarine blue. If I use phthalo blue, it will be too strong. So ultramarine blue is this blue here, whereas phthalo blue is that blue there. And you can see how intense phthalo blue is. It's a cooler blue, slightly more towards green, and it can be a bit too strong sometimes. But ultramarine blue is a very warm blue. It's sort of slightly towards red. So I'm going to just take a touch, and I mean a touch, into my orange. Do you see? And it changes it to an olivey green. It's looking a bit brown on screen, but I promise you this is an olivey green. And it's the perfect color for my stalk. And I'm just going to put that on there. I'm going to mix a little bit of yellow from here. I can reactivate these dried bits of yellow here and just put them around that little star shape because they're slightly lighter. And I'm going to put some lighter, I'm going to go right down so you can see what I'm doing, tone on one side of my stalk. You may not be able to see that, but I promise you the top of the stalk is looking a little bit lighter than the bottom. And then I've got that cut bit of stalk there. So that's the basis of that. And then I'm just going to use the same color here, dilute it with a bit of water to give me those. I'm just using the very tip of a round brush just to give me those little, the beginnings of those little pleats at the beginning, at the top of the orange. They look a bit harsh, so I'm going to just get some, put my brush in water and squeeze it with my fingers. I do it with my fingers because I want to feel that the brush is damp but not too dry. And I'm going to just go down there and soften them because I don't want them to be too prominent. Otherwise they can jump out at you and not look very natural. Because they're not lines, they're just shadows on either side of those pleats. Okay, now I'm going to go in with it. I'm going to mix some more of this. I'm going to reactivate that deep orange, take some of that dark greeny color that I mixed with the orange and the ultramarine blue, mix it up a bit just to make a darker orange. And you can see how this is why these bits of paper are so important, so you can test it. And what I should have done is used a bigger brush, but I haven't. So I'm just going to go around the edge with that color gently. Make it a bit darker. I don't want this too wet. When you do layers in watercolor, you want, as you put on layers, the next layer should be slightly drier than the one before. It's hard to remember, I know, but you kind of get to learn it as you go along. I'm going to pick up a bit more of that ultramarine and put into it. You can see when I do that, it makes it dark. The reason I'm using blue is because that's the opposite. On the color wheel, blue is the opposite to orange. It's called the complementary color. I always find that's a little bit odd because opposite and complementary are rather exclusive, aren't they? Now, while I've got to the bottom here, I'm going to do the shadow. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my other brush, make sure it's clean. It isn't. It doesn't matter. It's got a little bit of yellow on it. And remember that shadows they don't exist. Shadows are just areas where there is no light on the surface. And you can see that I'm coming out from the orange, not worrying too much about the shape, really. And then I'm going to go in with that mix of ultramarine and orange. And I always come out from the item. Because I don't want to I've got an awkward angle here because the camera is just above me, above the board. I don't want to get that, what I call the halo of fear around the orange. People often leave a little gap for some reason because they're scared of going up. But what we're doing is we're sharing up. Now I'm adding a teeny bit of orange because it looked a bit too, because there's always a reflection from the colour on the surface. Shadows are not just shadows, they are also reflections. I'm going to, when it's dry, I'll probably go it. Now, the danger is, you see, I shouldn't do this. I've got to let that dry because otherwise, if I start messing around like I am now, I'm going to overwork it and it'll look horrible. There's the shadow. I don't like that dark bit there, so I'm just going to go in with a clean brush and paint it out and soften it a bit. There. Right, I'm going to leave that for a moment to dry while I go over to the other cut orange, and I'm going to reactivate. I'm using the flat brush because I can get a nice pointy end to it, and I'm going to reactivate that lovely strong orange. And I'm going to go, because I can see the edge of the orange fruit, the edge of the fruit. Like that. You see just a tiny bit of the rind there. Now I'm going to get my round brush again, my little round brush. Make sure it's clean. And I'm just going to soften with clean water that edge because that rind slightly bleeds into that edge. I'm going to put a bit more. I've wet it, so I'm going to get a little bit of wet in wet bleeding here, which I like. So it's like a little blush of orange around here. And now I'm going to go back into my paint box. And got two on the go. And I'm going to put a bit more lemon yellow around the rind. Let's test it. Yeah. Yeah, I'm liking that. Maybe a bit strong. So what I'm going to do is now do a bit of, I'm going to squeeze my brush, make sure it's just damp, and lift that a little bit. There. Now, this is going to be fun. I haven't done this before. We'll see what happens. I've already got a bit of lemon yellow on there. I'm going to mix. The inside of the orange is quite juicy and citrusy, so I'm going to just make some lighter orange using cadmium yellow and the tiniest bit of cadmium red. It's a cadmium red pale. There. And now I think I'm just going to see what happens when I use the tip of my brush. Quite nice. And I can see all these little segments. Now you think, oh gosh, this is going to take forever. But once you get going, it's actually quite satisfying. And they're all very irregular. A bit like a butterfly wing. And the colour is uneven. There are some dark bits as well. I'm just holding my brush very upright so that I'm just using the tip of it. So you get a lovely, delicate, wiggly line. Keep looking at your orange. It'll help you enormously. And if your brush dries out, as mine is drying out, just put it in some water and reactivate. Lots of little juicy cells. Oops, gone a bit fat there, but it doesn't matter. I can see areas in my orange that are almost red. But I want to vary it. So some bits will be more orange and some bits will be more red. I'm going to get a bit more cadmium yellow. I see this paint is, I'm quite mean with my paint because paints are so expensive. So I just reactivate what's on the paper. So here it's gone a bit more yellow. That's okay. In fact, there are some bits on here. They're very yellow. There's a bit at the end, which is really yellow. So I'll keep doing that. There, so I've done lots of, you can see how it's varied. I'm just going to give it a few little dark bits here and there because I can see that on the orange itself, on the fruit. Right, the reason I haven't done the end bit here is because on mine, I think it's a navel orange, so it's got this slightly different coloured bit here, which is very yellow and gives it a bit more interest. I'm just going to go back into a bit more here. Right, so now I'm going to let that dry. I've got the edge of it. I'm going to just go into my sap green. Because there's a very, I don't know how to describe it, but there's just a little blush of green in this pithy rind. it's hardly there, but I just want to put it in there. And very occasionally I can see it in the orange itself. Now the rind is looking a bit pathetic. So I'm going to give it some, I'm going to mix up a bit more cadmium yellow, mix it in with some of the cadmium red, and just go round again. Just give it a few bits. Right, now I've got a lot of white on there, as you can see. So this is going to be, I'm going to take a deep breath. What you should do is try it out on here first. I'm just going to go in with some, I've made a mix of cadmium yellow and orange, but quite pale, more towards the yellow, not too much red in there. And I'm going to randomly paint over this, leaving bits of white, because that's the sparkle that you want in when you've cut a segment. You want those highlights. And you don't want it flat. You want all the different colours that you get. And you can see when you go over, if the paint's dry, when you go over those linear bits you did, they're still there. I'm just going to put over the end bit, which is quite, I'm just going to put some lemon yellow and I'm going to pick up a little bit of that green and just put it over the pith. I'm going to let that dry in a moment. Mustn't paint out my whites. There's it's quite defined at the edge. I'm just going to give it a few blobs around the edge here. And now I'm going to take some of that, remember that, the bit that I mixed with ultramarine up here, which is a bit browny, and I'm going to pick up a bit of the ultramarine, even though it's dry, I can reactivate it. And it makes a sort of dirty grey, greeny grey. I'm going to put some more orange into it. And then I'm going to give it a shadow so that it's sitting on a shadow. And I'm going to just come out from item. I don't like, I never use brown. In all my paint boxes, I don't know what, I think it's rather like boxes of chocolates. There are certain chocolates that I don't like. And I never use brown. I rarely use raw sienna, burnt umber. They're a bit of a waste in my paint box. You'll see every paint box I've got, the colours I don't use are raw sienna, burnt umber, never use them. Rarely use vermilion. Sorry, I beg your pardon, viridian. That's the bluey green. Right, now, so we've done the orange. Now, what's missing from here is the texture of the orange. And this is quite tricky. So there are a couple of things you can do. I could have put salt on it while it was wet, or I could use a wet paintbrush with just water on it and flick water. And what happens, although you can't see it very well there, is that it sometimes makes little circles. So that's one way of doing it. You would have to, the best thing for you to do is everyone will have ways that they like doing it. But I am going to mix up a darker color of orange. And you remember how I did that? I used ultramarine and orange together. It's come out a bit greeny brown. I quite like that. It's a bit dark, so I'm going to mix a little bit more of the orangey red into it. And it makes a browny color. It's a bit too browny, so I'm going to go back into my cadmium yellow and lighten it up a bit. That's better. It's made a greeny brown. And I'm going to, if you look at the orange, it's got these little pits, which are not black, they're not brown, they're a dark, well, they're dark orange, really, dark greeny, browny orange. And I'm just going to do a few dabs around here. I'm not going to go over the whole orange because A, I'll go mad and it won't look very good. And what happens is the brain fills in the rest. I'll just go in a bit closer. You can just see there where I've put some in. And what I'll do is so that they're not all the same color, rather like the way I was doing the segments, I'm going to put some slightly more orangey ones in. So these are going to be more orange. I'm going to put some orange dots as well. And remember, with watercolor, everything dries a little bit lighter, which can be very frustrating because you think you've got a really nice deep color, but actually when it dries, it isn't. I'm just going to do a few here and there. I'm not going to do it all over because if I do, it'll just look like it's got measles. I'm going to do a little bit of the highlights here are going to just put some pale yellow around here and dab it a bit. I'm going to mix it. So I put some watery pale yellow and I've got some orange now on here and I'm just going to dab it into the bits that are wet. So I'm using a variety of methods to make those little characteristic orange flesh marks. I'm blotting them with my finger too. I could have got my, on screen, my orange skin looks very dark red, but it actually isn't. I wonder if I, oh, it looks a bit, you can see here, I've got a very definite division of color there, and I'm not very happy with that. So I'm going to dampen my brush, not have it too wet, and I'm just going to go over it to soften it. This is can be a dangerous exercise because it lifts color off when you do it. But what I want to do, as well as soften it, and I don't really want to lift color off, so I'm going to just gently soften it. Okay, right, I'm going to show you one more method for getting that. Oh, something I want to do before we leave that is that I want to make this stem look a bit more 3D, and I'm going to use blue, activate a bit of this ultramarine here. So I get a sort of slightly greeny blue. So I've still got a bit of yellow and orange on my brush. Aha, I want to make it more blue. I want to define that stem a bit. Whoops, got a bit of that on it. Okay, that's good. So I'm going to go in here and just make that a bit stronger. Make that star a bit stronger. Right, now I'm going to show you one more way of making the orange a bit speckly. I'm going to just tear some kitchen towel up and put it around the edge. Cover that up because I don't want it on the segment. Just do it in a random way. Actually, I better take that. There we are. And then I'm going to get my fattest brush, get it quite wet, mix up all the colours on my bit of paper. Quite wet. Just going to do a test run here. What I'm going to do is I'll just show you. I'm going to get my finger and I'm going to splatter dots like that, make a splatter mark on my orange. And that's why it's good to test it to see how it's going to come out. So here we go. What that's like. I don't want to do too much. Now, if you've got any random bits that have crept out of the orange area, which I have there, and you don't want them, sometimes they look quite nice actually. But if you don't want them, just get a clean bit of kitchen towel, soak it in water, and you've only got 30 seconds to do this. You can just wash it off. If you leave that till tomorrow, it will not come off. Or it might, but it's most likely that it won't. So I've got rid of those dots now. I'm going to go and switch my studio lights on. Whoops, that's quite interesting. Couldn't help that. I just wanted to make that a bit stronger. Just using the side of my brush. And I'm going to make that a bit stronger around here. That dark bit where the orange is touching the surface of the table. No light gets in. So it's very dark. But again, I don't want to use black or brown. Now I'm just going to put my studio lights on because it's gone very dark in my studio. And I'm going to see what it looks like with more light. Doesn't make a huge amount of difference, but my screen has made it look darker than I've painted it. It's much more nearer the color of the orange. So that's an orange. And you do a similar thing with a carrot. I must say, I do like the, this looks quite nice, I think. This one, I probably, see, these are the things that you shouldn't do, is randomly put paintbrush marks on, but I'm doing it because I'm having a go. Right, that's actually not looking too bad, but we'll see. If you haven't left a white area, you can go in with some white gouache and with an almost dry brush and put some marks on. The other thing you can do, but it's quite, as I said, you can't do it if the paint is too dry, but you can do some lift off. And the paint isn't completely dry, so I can lift off some orange there. That's the orange. I'm going to turn the studio lights off because they're making too many shadows. Anyway, so that's how to do an orange, and the similar thing with a carrot. So we'll leave the carrot for another time. I think that's enough for you to do, but I think you've probably worked out how to do it. So you add a little bit of blue to make the orange dark at the end, but always start with lemon yellow, go to cadmium yellow on top, then mix cadmium red and cadmium yellow, and you should get a lovely orange. Thanks for watching.